History is full of survival stories, accounts of people who endured the absolute unimaginable and lived to tell the tale. Their stories become monuments, testaments to the human spirit. But what happens when one of those monuments, a figure of incredible courage, just crumbles, disappearing without a trace? What are we supposed to make of a story that has no ending? This is the central haunting question in the life of Solomon Northup. He was a free man, stolen into slavery. He survived 12 years of brutality and then, against impossible odds, won his freedom back and told the world his story. His memoir, 12 Years a Slave, made him a celebrity and a powerful voice for abolition. But just a few years later, the man who survived so much simply vanished. Solomon Northup, a national symbol of resilience, disappeared from history, leaving a mystery that's been cold for over 150 years. So, what happened to the freed man who vanished forever? To really get the depth of the tragedy that hit Solomon Northup, you first have to understand the life that was stolen from him. Before he was a slave, before he was a famous author, he was a man living a life of quiet dignity and doing pretty well for himself in Saratoga Springs, New York. Born a free person of color around 1807, Solomon's very existence was a kind of victory. His father, Mintus Northup, was born into slavery but was manumitted or freed in his owner's will. Mintus took the last name of the family that once owned him, which was common, and built a life for his family as a free man. He was a farmer, a landowner, and he taught his sons Solomon and Joseph the value of hard work, education, and just how precious their freedom really was. Solomon grew up able to read and write at a time when that was a rarity for any American, let alone a person of color. He worked on the family farm, learned carpentry, and became a skilled raftsman. But his real passion, the talent that would define his life in both freedom and slavery, was music. Solomon Northup was a virtuoso on the violin, or as people called it, the fiddle. His talent made him famous all over Washington County. He was the life of the party, the sound of celebrations, a man whose music brought joy to his community. In 1829, he married Anne Hampton, a woman of mixed black, white, and indigenous heritage. By all accounts, they had a loving and productive partnership. Together they had 3 children, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo. For a while they worked their own farm, but the bustling resort town of Saratoga Springs offered new opportunities, and the family moved there in 1834. During the busy summer seasons, Solomon worked as a carriage driver for the big hotels, ferrying wealthy tourists around town. His nights were filled with music, as his reputation as a fiddler got him well-paying gigs at the United States Hotel and other top spots. Anne was a skilled and sought-after cook, often working in the very same hotels. Together, they built a comfortable life. They owned property, their kids were getting an education, and they were respected members of their community. But this peaceful picture was painted on a very fragile canvas. The United States in the 1840s was a nation violently torn apart by slavery. Even in a free state like New York, the shadow of the South was long. The air was thick with the talk of slave catchers and the constant fear that freedom could be snatched away in a heartbeat. Free black communities were targeted by kidnappers, known as blackbirders, who would abduct free men, women, and children, destroy their free papers, and sell them into the insatiable machine of the southern slave markets. Every stranger was a potential threat. Every trip carried a risk. Solomon knew these dangers well. He was a husband and a father with everything to lose, but he was also ambitious, a man who wanted the best for his family. And it was this ambition, this trust in his fellow man, that led him straight into a trap. The spring of 1841 started with promise. Anne and the children were away in another town for work, and Solomon was between jobs. It was during this lull that 2 men, dressed impeccably and acting very sophisticated, showed up in Saratoga Springs. They called themselves Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. They claimed to be performers with a traveling circus on their way to Washington, D.C. They'd heard, they said, about a fiddler of incredible talent in town. They flattered Solomon and made him an offer that was almost too good to be true for a working musician. They needed a violinist and would pay him well, $1 for every day of travel and $3 for each performance, plus expenses. It was a huge sum, a chance to make good money fast. Washington, D.C., however, was a different world. It was the nation's capital, but it was also a place where slavery was legal. It was a borderland between the free North and the slave South, and a notorious hub for the domestic slave trade. For a free black man to travel there without his papers, which Solomon in his rush had left behind, was a huge risk. Blinded by the opportunity and the seemingly genuine nature of the men, Solomon agreed. He figured it would be a short trip. He told his neighbors where he was going and set off. The journey south was pleasant. The men were charming and treated him like an equal. When they got to Washington, they even paid him for a performance as promised. They encouraged him to celebrate with them, to have a drink. It was here, in a tavern in the capital, that the deception reached. At its terrifying end, Solomon, suspecting nothing, took a glass of wine. Soon after, he felt horribly sick. The men, pretending to be concerned, helped him back to his room. The last thing he remembered was their faces hovering over him as he passed out. He awoke in darkness, confused, and then he heard it. The chilling clink of iron. His ankles and wrists were in heavy shackles. His fine clothes were gone, replaced by rags. His money, his things, and his identity had all been stolen. He was in a damp stone cell. When he cried out, insisting he was a free man from New York, he was met not with help, but with brutal, soul-crushing violence. He'd been taken to the Williams slave pen, an infamous holding facility. He was no longer Solomon Northup, husband, father, musician. In the eyes of his captors, he was property. His kidnapper, a notorious slave trader named James H. Birch, told him he was now a runaway slave from Georgia. When Solomon kept protesting, he was beaten with a wooden paddle and whipped with a cat-o'-nine-tails until he fell silent, blood pooling on the floor. The message was clear. His old life was over. To speak of it again would mean death. The man who entered D.C., a free man, was now trapped in a living nightmare, headed for the slave markets of the Deep South. From Birch's slave pen, Solomon was herded onto a ship, the Orleans, bound for the slave markets of New Orleans. On board, he and the other captives were chained together in the ship's hold. During the voyage, Solomon befriended a sailor and entrusted him with a letter to mail to his family. The sailor promised to help, but Solomon would never know if it reached them. Hope, he was learning, was a dangerous thing. Once in New Orleans, a city built on the trade of human beings, Solomon was put on display. He and others were inspected like livestock, teeth checked, limbs examined, bodies stripped and scrutinized. It was here he was given a new name to erase his past, Platt Hamilton. Solomon's next masters would show him the true horror of slavery. He was first passed to a cruel carpenter named John M. Tibeats. Tibeats hated Solomon's intelligence and quiet dignity. After one of many clashes, Tibeats attacked Solomon, but Solomon fought back and overpowered him. Humiliated, Tibeats returned with two other men to lynch him. Solomon was tied up with a noose around his neck and was only saved at the last second when Ford's overseer reminded Tibeats that killing Solomon would be a financial loss. After another violent fight, Tibeats finally sold Solomon to the man who would be his master for the next decade, Edwin Epps. If Ford was the benevolent face of slavery, Epps was its monstrous heart. Epps was a cotton planter known for his cruelty, a man who ruled his plantation with fear and sadistic violence. He was a heavy drinker, with a violent, unpredictable temper. Life under Epps was a relentless cycle of backbreaking labor and terror. The day began before sunrise and ended long after sunset, with slaves driven into the cotton fields. Failing to meet the daily picking quota meant a guaranteed whipping. The sound of the lash was the daily music of the Epps plantation. Solomon wrote of Epps's whipping moods, where he seemed to take a sick pleasure in torture, often fueled by alcohol. Solomon himself wasn't spared. Though he was a skilled carpenter and sometimes a driver forced to whip his fellow slaves, he suffered the same brutal treatment. One of the most harrowing parts of life on the Epps plantation was his connection to a young enslaved woman named Patsy. Patsy was the plantation's most efficient cotton picker, but her skill only brought her suffering. Epps subjected her to relentless sexual abuse, while Epps's jealous wife inflicted her own cruel punishments. In one of the most agonizing scenes in his memoir, Solomon described being forced by Epps to brutally whip a naked and helpless Patsy, an act that haunted him forever. For 12 years, Solomon endured this hell. He kept his true identity a secret, knowing the claim would only lead to more violence or death. He tried to escape multiple times, but the Louisiana landscape of swamps and bayous made it nearly impossible. Hope was almost extinguished, buried under a decade of trauma. But then, in 1852, a new man arrived, Samuel Bass, a white carpenter from Canada hired by Epps to build a house. Bass was an unusual man for that time and place. He was an outspoken abolitionist who openly debated slavery with Epps himself. Solomon watched Bass for a long time, trying to gauge if he was sincere. Trusting a white man here was an unbelievable risk. If he was wrong, it meant certain death. But after years of silence, Solomon was desperate. He finally confided in Bass, revealing his real name and his life as a free man in New York. Bass, true to his word, was horrified. He risked his own safety and agreed to help, secretly writing and mailing several letters for Solomon. One letter was addressed to Henry B. Northup, a white lawyer and a relative of the family that had once owned Solomon's father. This letter, unlike the one from a decade earlier, found its mark. The arrival of that letter in Saratoga Springs set off a chain reaction that would finally break Solomon's chains. The community was stunned. Henry B. Northup, armed with proof of Solomon's free status and backed by a New York state law to rescue kidnapped citizens, got the governor's approval. In January 1853, Henry B. Northup traveled to Louisiana. He found Samuel Bass, who led him to the Epps plantation. The rescue was dramatic. The local sheriff, a legal representative, and Henry Northup confronted a shocked and furious Edwin Epps. On January 4, 1853, after 12 long years, Solomon Northup was declared a free man. His reunion with his family was bittersweet. His children were now grown. His wife, Anne, had endured years of not knowing if he was alive or dead. Their lives had been changed forever. Back in the North, Solomon didn't retreat into a quiet life. He had a story to tell. That same year, working with a writer named David Wilson, he published his memoir, 12 Years a Slave. The book was an instant sensation, selling nearly 30,000 copies in its first 2 years. Alongside narratives from Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, it was a powerful first-hand account of slavery's horrors. What shocked Northern readers most was that he was a free man who had been stolen. His story showed that slavery was a threat to every black person in America, directly refuting pro-slavery arguments that it was a benevolent institution. The book made Solomon a national celebrity and a key figure in the abolitionist movement. He went on extensive speaking tours across the Northeast. He stood before packed halls, a living witness to the crimes of the South. He became a target for pro-slavery sympathizers, but also a beacon of hope for the cause. He also sought justice in court, but this proved to be deeply frustrating. He sued James H. Birch, the slave trader in Washington, D.C. The case fell apart. As a black man, Solomon was legally barred from testifying against a white person in a D.C. court. Birch was acquitted. He then went after his original kidnappers, who were arrested in New York. But after years of legal battles, the case was dropped in 1857. The men who stole 12 years of his life never faced punishment for their crime. Despite these setbacks, Solomon kept fighting. He bought property for his family and continued to advocate for abolition. He had survived the unimaginable, turned his trauma into a weapon against injustice, and reclaimed his life. He was a symbol of survival, which makes what happened next so baffling. After 4 years in the public eye, 4 years of fighting and speaking, the historical record of Solomon Northup starts to fray. The clear path he'd been on since his rescue suddenly gets overgrown and impossible to follow. After 1857, the man who was a national celebrity begins to fade away. The last widely reported public sighting of him was in August 1857. He was on a lecture tour in Canada when he was met by a hostile, jeering crowd in Streetsville, Ontario. He was reportedly shouted down with racial slurs and forced to flee the event. This incident shows the very real dangers abolitionist speakers faced, even in supposedly friendly places. After that, the verifiable sightings stop. Solomon Northup, author, activist, and survivor, simply disappears. He seems to have separated from his family around this time. Census records from the 1860s show his wife Anne living with their daughter and son-in-law, but Solomon isn't listed with them. This doesn't prove they were estranged. He could have been traveling for work, but it's a significant change. There were rumors he may have had money troubles. Despite his book's success, he only earned about $3,000 from it. Pro-slavery newspapers, eager to discredit him, ran stories suggesting he'd become a worthless tramp. The last tantalizing, unconfirmed clue comes from a letter written decades later, in the 1930s. The letter was from the son of a Vermont minister, Reverend John L. Smith. The son claimed his father had worked with Solomon Northup in the early 1860s during the Civil War, helping fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad. The letter even mentioned Northup visiting the Reverend sometime after the Emancipation Proclamation in early 1863. If that's true, it would be the last known trace of Solomon Northup. After that point, there's nothing. No death certificate, no grave, no obituary. He vanishes from the record completely. For a man this famous, the silence is deafening, and in that silence, a host of dark theories have grown. The complete disappearance of a figure as prominent as Solomon Northup has baffled historians for over a century. With no hard evidence, several compelling and conflicting theories have sprung up. The most obvious and sinister theory is that he was kidnapped a second time and sold back into slavery. This was the immediate fear of his family and friends. In the 1850s, with the Fugitive Slave Act in full force, this was terrifyingly plausible. Re-kidnapping the most famous stolen man in America would have been the ultimate act of vengeance for his pro-slavery enemies. However, many modern historians think this is unlikely. By the late 1850s, Solomon would have been in his early 50s, considered too old to bring a high price at auction, making the risk of kidnapping him not worth the reward. A related theory is that he was murdered for revenge. He had powerful enemies, the slave traders he exposed, the kidnappers he tried to prosecute. An ambush on a lonely road, a quiet murder, a body disposed of. It would have been an effective way to silence him. The fact that the cases against his kidnappers were dismissed in 1857, the very year he disappears, adds a chilling layer to this idea. A third, more hopeful theory suggests he chose to disappear to work on the Underground Railroad. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. We have the second-hand account of him helping fugitives in New England during the Civil War. There are also family recollections of him working with the legendary Harriet Tubman. The Underground Railroad was a network of secrets. To be an effective conductor, you'd need to keep a low profile. This theory recasts his vanishing not as a tragedy, but as a heroic final chapter. Another version of this theory suggests he was a spy for the Union Army during the Civil War. His intimate knowledge of Louisiana and his ability to act like a slave would have made him an invaluable intelligence asset. Spying creates no paper trail, and his death in the line of duty would explain his disappearance without a record. Finally, there's the most mundane and perhaps most tragic possibility. He died of natural causes, alone and unknown. Plagued by money problems and likely suffering from what we'd now call severe PTSD, he may have become a drifter. He could have died in a small town, his body buried in a potter's field, his identity unknown. Some historians believe this is the most likely scenario, pointing to census data that lists his wife Anne as a widow by 1875. This suggests he died sometime between 1863 and 1875. In this version, there's no grand conspiracy, just a quiet, lonely end for a man who had already endured so much. Each of these theories paints a vastly different picture of Solomon Northup's final years. Was he a victim of a vengeful system, a secret hero of the resistance, or a lost soul who drifted into anonymity? We may never know for sure, but the conversation is important. What do you think happened to Solomon Northup? Share your theories in the comments below, and if you find historical mysteries like this compelling, please consider subscribing for more stories of the lost and forgotten. The story of Solomon Northup is a story of two disappearances. The first was a violent kidnapping that stole 12 years of his life, but left behind a powerful testimony. The second was a silent fade from history that has left us with nothing but questions. It's a profound and unsettling irony. A man endures one of the most brutal systems of oppression ever devised. He survives. He miraculously regains his freedom, finds his voice, and tells his story to the world, creating a work that echoes for centuries. And then, he's lost to us again. His book, 12 Years a Slave, remains a masterpiece of American literature, a vital document that forces us to confront the darkest parts of our collective past. But the final chapters of Solomon's own life are blank pages. The mystery of his disappearance is a stark reminder that for so many people in the 19th century, especially Black Americans, survival itself didn't guarantee a full life or even a known death. Their final moments were often just not recorded, deemed unworthy of history's attention. Solomon Northup's empty grave is a monument to this silence. It asks us to consider not just the story he told, but the one we can never know. What happened to the freed man who vanished forever? The question hangs in the air, a haunting and unanswered echo from the past.